commander, who talked it over with the brigade commander, who talked it over with the division commander, who talked it over with the corps commander, who talked it over with Grant. Now, Grant at first was opposed to the idea based on his experiences here, but he realized the merit to be had and the confidence that would give the soldiers knowing that their commanding general was listening to their suggestions. And so it would also keep the troops busy. Busy troops are troops with high morale. Troops that are idle, their morale plummets tremendously. And so for a variety of reasons, Grant would authorize the detonation of the mine at Petersburg, although he himself did not put much faith in its success. Yes, sir.
Well, by him not backing down on unconditional surrender, these soldiers show up again. A lot of them, don't they, in the battles?
Well, that's a good question. How many show back up again? We don't know. Now, the entire Vicksburg garrison would be declared exchanged by the end of September of 1863. Many of these men will indeed be seen in combat again. Much of Carter Stevenson's division, for example, has the dubious distinction of being captured once again at Chattanooga just 2 months later in November of 1863. Realizing that these were former Vicksburg soldiers, Grant, in command of the army there at Chattanooga, declared these men in violation of their parole and threatened to execute them all. This caused such a ruckus between Union and Confederate officials that the Dix Hill Cartel was discontinued. Due to the discontinuation of the Dix Hill Cartel and that system of prisoner exchange, this led directly to the rise of the prison pens that we're all so familiar with: Cahaba, Andersonville, Johnson's Island, Bell Island, Camp Randall, and so on. But how many come back, we don't know. I don't think it is a great number, however. Immediately following the siege of Vicksburg, as these men are paroled, under the terms of their parole, they were to be marched overland to what were called exchange camps, situated in Thermopolis, Alabama, and Enterprise, Mississippi. En route to those camps, John Pemberton, in communications with the authority in Richmond, claimed that the Army is ripe for mutiny. They are so demoralized by the defeat at Vicksburg, so worn out by the rigors of the campaign and the suffering of the siege, that these men need to be sent home. Pemberton begged the authorities in Richmond to furlough these men. Otherwise, he said, this army will mutiny. Davis was against the idea. He said, we have immediate active service for these guys. We could use them elsewhere. He did not realize the extent of the suffering demoralization that was prevalent in this army. But based on Pemberton's recommendation, much of the Vicksburg garrison would be furloughed for a period anywhere from 15 days to 30 days, depending on how far away they lived. Now, obviously, soldiers from Missouri could not go home. Soldiers from Kentucky, parts of Tennessee, Louisiana could not go home as well, so they would report to the parole camps. But many guys were paroled and went home, and a very large number of those soldiers never returned to fight. Okay, folks, let's get back on the bus and we'll answer more questions en route. I'd like to make one more stop before we go for lunch. Need a hand? On the way back from 3rd Louisiana Redan, several people asked, what happened to Pemberton after the siege? Well, Pemberton was immediately exchanged. As he was riding eastward to report to the authorities in Richmond, the terms of his parole initially read that he is to report to his superiors. His superior, of course, militarily is Joseph B. Johnston. Johnston, as you recall, does nothing during the course of the siege. We'll talk more about him later on today, but Pemberton is very bitter against Joseph Johnston. He blames Joe Johnston for the loss of Vicksburg in its entirety. So anyway, he rides over to report to General Johnston, whose headquarters at this time were in Brandon, I believe. Johnston was sitting on the front porch in a rocker when Pemberton rode up. Johnston immediately rises to his feet, walks down the step, and extends his hand and says, "John, it's good to see you." Pemberton salutes very coldly and says, "General Johnston, by the terms of my parole, I am to report to you, sir, I have done so." And he turned around and walked away, and the two men never saw each other again for the duration of the war. Pemberton reported to the authorities in Richmond, where he was immediately placed on the shelf, if you will, in military parlance. There just wasn't a need for a lieutenant general any longer because the Confederates had reached their zenith in manpower and were now going downhill very rapidly. Not wishing to be left on the shelf, and no doubt in hopes of recovering some of his military prestige, whatever it may have been, Pemberton voluntarily resigned his commission as a lieutenant general and accepted a much lower commission, that of a lieutenant colonel, and remained in Confederate service for the duration of the siege. Now, it may interest you to learn, late in 1863, Jefferson Davis, you recall the story of the cabal over in Chattanooga, where many of the subordinates, including Longstreet, are trying to get rid of Braxton Bragg. Well, Davis will go to Chattanooga. He'll take Pemberton with him and offer Pemberton to Bragg. Bragg doesn't want him. None of the other generals said that they would ever serve with Pemberton. So I'm not able to find a spot for Pemberton. Pemberton realized he has no recourse but to resign his commission, which he does. But anyway, during the siege of Richmond and Petersburg, Confederate General Robert E. Lee, in deference to Pemberton's former stature as a lieutenant general, always invited him to councils of war. And he always referred to him as General Pemberton, and he would tolerate no disrespect for Pemberton whatsoever from his own subordinate officers. But after the war, Pemberton is given a farm by his mother. Despite resigning his commission and siding with the Confederacy, Mama loved her son Johnny. And so Johnny was given a farm near Warrenton, Virginia. He tried his hand at farming, but he was a dismal failure at that as well. Finally, he returned to the city of his birth, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where he lived out the remainder of his life very quietly. He died there in 1881 and is interred in Philadelphia today in the same cemetery and not very far from his closest boyhood friend, George Gordon Meade. As we continue along the Union siege lines, again, bear in mind the Confederate line is off to your left. At this point, several hundred yards, about 300 to 400 yards. We're crossing over Glass Bayou. This is one of the few streams that has water in it year-round. It originates on your right, flows through the Confederate defense perimeter, and into the Mississippi River on your left. This stream was a major source of drinking water for the Confederate garrison. Knowing, however, that it originated within his own lines, Grant ordered the stream poisoned as it left Union lines. So the rotting carcasses of mules and cattle were thrown in, making that stream unfit for drinking. By the end of June, the garrison of Vicksburg is subsisting on 1 cup of water per man per day. And you can imagine the intense suffering, the heat of a Mississippi summer, and such limited quantities of food and water. Just 2 weeks ago, we had a 10-inch rain here in Vicksburg. I guess in my tenure here, we've had 4 or 5 of those 10-inch rains. They're referred to as a 500-year rain, but we've had we've had a number of them in just my tenure here. But we've had 27 slop-offs in the park, some of which are threatening our roads, bridges, our monuments, and so on. Here's one of the worst ones off to your left. And you'll see it as we round the bend here. It goes down 60 straight feet.
Whoa.
Yeah, that's a problem.
And so we are trying to get emergency funding through the Federal Highways Administration for stabilization of this road and then permanent repair. Now here's a wonderful opportunity to get a picture of an eagle sitting on somebody's head if you want. This monument up to your left front
Thanks a lot.
is the Wisconsin Monument.
Oh, Dave.
Wisconsin's monument is the only other monument in this park that lists the names of its soldiers who fought in the Vicksburg Campaign. There were roughly 9,000 Wisconsin soldiers involved in the operations here. Crowning this column is a 6-foot bronze likeness of Old Abe, the famous war eagle that accompanied the 8th Wisconsin Volunteers during the course of its service in the Civil War. In 1864, Old Abe was honorably mustered out of service and returned to Wisconsin. The bird was placed on a perch of honor in the Capitol building in Madison, but several years after the Civil War, the Capitol building caught on fire, and Old Abe died of smoke inhalation. Well, the bird was stuffed and placed on a perch of honor in a different portion of the Capitol building, but a few years later, even that portion of the building caught on fire and completely consumed the earthly remains of Old Abe. So although Abe is no longer with us physically, Abe is still very much alive in the hearts and minds of the United States Army, because if any of you have ever seen a member of the 101st Airborne Infantry on their shoulder patches, the famous Screaming Eagles, that is Old Abe of Vicksburg fame. Okay, George, we'll continue on. Several years back, I had the distinct honor of escorting General William Westmoreland on a personal tour of the park. I spent about 8 hours with the general, very dignified and gracious man, but someone had told me that, of course, Westmoreland used to command the 101st Airborne Infantry. And somebody told me once that the general, in his inspections of the division, used to walk up and down the lines with a stuffed bald eagle on his arm, symbolic of old Abe. I never did ask him, though, if that were true.
Ben Franklin had his way in Turkey.
That's right. Don reminded me, had Ben Franklin had his way, it would have been a turkey sitting atop of the Wisconsin Monument.
Hey, Harry, tell me about the Chinese guy with his name on one of these.
I'm
The
sorry.
Chinese guy on ONG. Okay, we'll have to tell you about that. Okay.
You recall the story of Albert Cashier, the female soldier of the 95th Infantry from Illinois. Albert's regiment was part of the 17th Union Army Corps, and as we round the bend here, the very first monument on your left, you'll see, is that of the 95th Infantry. So this is the general area where Albert Cashier was involved in action during the Vicksburg siege. Now here at Vicksburg, as mentioned, our boundaries are very, very narrow. In fact, you can stand right here where we are, and even I, with a very bad arm, can throw a stone outside the park. You can see right there how narrow our boundary is. We are right now negotiating for 13 different parcels of land in a desperate attempt to try to push our boundary out just a little more in hopes of more adequately safeguarding the resources entrusted to our care. We're now moving out of the realm of operations, the area of operations of the 17th Army Corps, and moving into that of the 15th Army Corps, which was commanded by Major General William Sherman. We are moving our way slowly up toward the Graveyard Road, where we're going to make a very quick stop. Let's see, it's already 20 to 12, Rob? Oh, I'm sorry.
Quarter after.
Oh, very good. We'll make a stop along the Graveyard Road and detail Sherman's assaults on May 19 and May 22nd. After that, we'll make a dash out of the park. We're going to have lunch today at Goldie's Trail Barbecue. It's a wonderful barbecue, the best barbecue in Mississippi, and certainly the best between Memphis and New Orleans, so I hope you all would like barbecue. We'll also, while we're in that area, walk across the street to South Fort, the southern anchor of the Confederate defense perimeter, and talk a little bit about those river fortifications. Then we'll come back into the park and resume our tour where we leave off here. We're now in the realm of operations of the 15th Corps commanded by William Sherman. You recall that it is Sherman's troops that are the first to reach the perimeter of the Vicksburg fortifications. You recall that Sherman does not fight in the Battle of Big Black River Bridge, but during that day he hastens towards the pending field of battle with the Army's pontoon train. He will actually bridge the river at Bridgeport, and on May the 17th actually cross one of his two divisions. So on May the 17th, the 15th Corps is the very first Union Corps to cross the Big Black River. Early on the morning of May the 18th, his 2nd Division will cross, and together those two divisions will push hard for Vicksburg, arriving late in the afternoon and actually engage Confederate forces in the vicinity of Graveyard Road. Realizing that Grant was going to order an assault as early as practicable, Sherman that day would make a reconnaissance of the Confederate works. Although he would find them strong and formidable indeed, he would prepare for the assault. Here on your left, the very next monument is that honoring, I'm sorry, not the next one, but that white one up there, honoring the men of the 1st Battalion, 13th United States Infantry, one of only 2 regular Army units with Grant at Vicksburg. And here at Vicksburg, they would gain everlasting renown. And we'll tell you about that in just a moment. On your right, coming up, is a relief portrait of Brigadier General Hugh Ewing. Now, Ewing happened to be Sherman's not only brother-in-law, but foster brother as well. You recall that Sherman, at an early age, was orphaned. He was adopted by Senator Thomas Ewing of Ohio, and Sherman thus became foster brother to Charles Thomas and, who's the other Ewing? Charles Thomas and Hugh. And then he married Ellen Ewing.
We'll pull in right up by this car. This will disembark at that point. I'm going to ask you, Mike here, George. If you'll drop us off here, as you continue around the road, you need to make a left-hand turn up onto that road on the hillside. It's a pretty tight turn. You might want to walk it over and see if you can make that. If so, I'd like you to make that turn onto the Graveyard Road and just wait for us there. And what we'll be doing is just board the bus, because that'll expedite our getting out of the park and going on to lunch and
Folks, if you'll follow me off the bus, we're going to walk down the sidewalk here past the big cannon that you see, and that's a 30-pounder Harris, by the way, fires a 30-pound projectile. And we'll stand in the shade of that tall tree and talk about the action here on Sherman's front. To locate the exact location of those pits. Folks, we just have a seat here. I don't think the ground is too damp. You come well prepared, don't you?
Terry, if it wasn't for this, I'd never do it. My dream was once to walk Pickett's Charge. I wanted to do that more than anything. And I took a chair and I walked it.
Very good.
And I made it.
Very good.
I did that once.
Oh, John, you did do it once. John had a wonderful time when he walked Pickett's Charge. There's a big story.
You'll have to tell it over lunch. Folks, again, this is how we are oriented. We have moved from the Jackson Road and the 3rd Louisiana Redan area north along the Botetourt Road and are now out here on what's called the Graveyard Road. Now, it's called the Graveyard Road not due to the high battle casualties that took place in this area, but simply due to the fact the city cemetery, Cedar Hill Cemetery, is along this road about a mile off to your left. And it is in Cedar Hill Cemetery where the Confederate dead who died during this siege are interred. After all, the Confederates had to bury their own dead somewhere behind their lines, and so they selected the most logical location, the city cemetery. And that's where the Confederate dead remain interred today and are properly memorialized there. Guarding the Graveyard Road, entrance into the city of Vicksburg, is a complex of fortifications known simply as the Stockade Redan Complex. You see the Graveyard Road here. We are standing approximately right here where this X is at. You see the stockade, again, a triangular shaped fortification, and you see the classic triangular walls of the Stockade Redan towering on the high ground in the distance before you. To your right, you'll see 3 white stones in close order. That's the 27th Louisiana Lunette, a crescent-shaped fortification. And off to your left, you might see the white shaft over there of the Arkansas Monument. That's in the vicinity of Green's Redan. Sometimes it's referred to as Green's Redoubt. But it will be this series of fortifications guarding this angle that you can see in the Confederate line that will guard the Graveyard Road access into the city. On May the 18th of 1863, General Sherman's Corps, the 15th, will be the first to arrive at Vicksburg's back door. They will unlimber their artillery, send their skirmishers forward, drive Confederate skirmishers from an outer line of works here into the city's main fortifications. That evening, Sherman receives orders to storm the works with the rising sun. And so throughout the course of the night, Sherman prepares his troops accordingly. On the morning of May the 19th of 1863, early in the morning, Union artillery pieces, about 20 in number, here in this position, will open fire against the Confederate fortifications, and for several hours will pummel those works with solid shots and shell. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the guns fall silent, which is the signal for the infantry to advance. Now, based on his reconnaissance, Sherman realizes these fortifications are formidable indeed. And down here in these ravines on either side of the Graveyard Road is that obstruction of felled trees known as abattis. Down here are those pits at the bottom of which is sharpened bamboo and cane. There are numerous fence rows, and even over here there are a few buildings and outbuildings. Numerous obstructions to his advance. And I think you'll find, if you make a sober evaluation of Sherman's actions, first at Chickasaw Bayou, here at Vicksburg on May the 19th, at Chattanooga at Tunnel Hill, if Sherman doesn't think his attack has a chance of success, he is going to minimize the number of troops involved in the attack. Minimize them to minimize his casualties, yet have a sufficient number of men to make it appear that he made an honest effort. Not believing that his troops can capture this fortification, although he has several divisions available to him, he will launch only one division in this attack. That will be the division commanded by General Frank Blair, whose brother Montgomery is the Postmaster General of the United States. Blair, a political general, happens to be one of the finer, more talented political officers produced by the American Civil War. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Blair's men will form for the assault here on this ridgeline where we're now standing. As one Confederate soldier wrote, as we peered over our parapets, we caught sight of the enemy forming for the advance, with man touching man, rank pressing rank, line supporting line. We watched as their officers rode up and down the lines, giving encouragement to their men, making sure that all was set for the advance. We watched as they uncased their colors before them that caught the breeze above them, and we listened to the sound of the cold steel as they affixed the bayonets in final preparation for the advance. Then at a slow and steady pace, Blair's men moved across these fields astride Graveyard Road. Out here on your right were the men of the 1st Battalion, 13th United States Infantry, one of only 2 regular Army units with Grant at Vicksburg. This unit had been commissioned by the Congress in 1861. Its first colonel was William T. Sherman, and so for that reason, to this very date, that unit is referred to as Sherman's own. Here at Vicksburg, the regulars, only 250 in number, attesting to their casualties on other fields of battle, was led by the gallant Captain Edward Washington, grandnephew of George himself. The regulars line up off to your right, and all eyes of the volunteers turn to the regulars to see what they would do. Moving forward with their national colors and their regimental crest, they move across what was then a cornfield to the edge of the ridgeline where you see that line of cannon and monuments across the road here. There was a stout post and rail fence that was an obstruction to their advance. Captain Washington ordered men forward to remove the rails, knock the post over, remove that obstruction from their advance. But mind you, it was a very stout fence, and they were unable to dismantle it. As a result, as the regulars advanced, they came up to the fence and had to stop. And it is at this moment the Confederates rise en masse, look over their parapets, and let loose a withering volley of musketry. Scores of the regulars will fall to the ground. Those who were unharmed broke rank, poured down into the ravines where they encountered that obstruction of felled trees. Filtering their way through the obstruction singly and in small groups, the regulars wound their way crawling on all fours up the opposite slope, and a handful of those men would actually reach the ditch. Reaching the ditch with these men were both the national colors and the regimental crest. 17 flag bearers were killed or mortally wounded carrying those colors forward a mere 400 yards. Each time the colors fell to the ground, they were picked up and carried forward, ever forward. Moving up the opposite slope, the flag fell to the ground once again, and this time I'm referring to the national colors. Charles Ewing, a captain in the 1st Battalion, brother-in-law of William T. Sherman, picked up those colors. So exhausted was he by the climb out of that ditch that he sat on top of a stump of a tree, held the flag up high and waved it, urging his men forward when his thumb was shot off. Without his opposing digit, he could no longer grasp the flag, and it fell to the ground once more when a private picked it up, sprang across the road, jumped into the ditch fronting the stockade, and stabbed it into the ground. It is the first Union colors to be placed on the parapets of Vicksburg. It would be joined there by the regimental crest, and there the flags of the 1st Battalion, 13th U.S. Infantry would proudly wave side by side throughout the hot afternoon of May the 19th. But only a handful of regulars would make it to the ditch. Those that did actually took out their bayonets and started carving holes in the ditch to use as hand and footholds to try to claw their way out. One man took the standard and held it aloft when the flagstaff was shot and all the battle ribbons floated to the ground. Elsewhere along the line, the Union troops were pinned down out on this ridgeline where you see the cannon today, pinned down by a murderous fire of artillery and musketry. Out here on this firing line were the men of the 55th Illinois, led by Colonel Oscar Malmberg. Now, Malmberg was a Swedish immigrant He was a stern disciplinarian, a tyrant. Some would call him a martinet. Out there on the firing line, his troops banged away against the Confederates throughout the hot afternoon until their munition supplies were almost depleted. Here, Malmberg, faced with a difficult decision to either pull his men out of line or call up a fresh supply, he was fearful if he pulled his troops out of line, it may cause mass panic among all the Federal troops and lead to a retrograde of Sherman's entire force. But he was reluctant to order anybody to the rear to call up a fresh supply of munitions, believing that it was instant death for anybody to do so. And so he called for volunteers. And 4 men volunteered for this hazardous assignment, including a young musician by the name of Orion P. Howe. Down the graveyard road they ran just as fast as their legs would carry them. 3 of the 4 men were killed outright. Orion Howe himself was badly wounded, taking a bullet in the leg, and fell hard to the ground. Undaunted by this wound, the young musician picked himself up, dusted himself off, and continued to hobble down the road until he spotted a familiar figure on horseback, no less an individual than Major General William T. Sherman. Howe hobbled up to Sherman, saluted smartly, and began to recount the situation of the troops on the firing line. Sherman, on horseback, gazing down at this young lad, could tell by the ashen complexion on his face, the blood streaming down his leg, that he was badly wounded. Yet he listened intently to his story, and when Howe had finished his report, he ordered him to the rear and to hospitalization. Sherman said, "I will see to it personally, the young man, that fresh supplies of munitions are carried forward." As Howe continued hobbling down the road, he suddenly wheeled about and yelled, "54 caliber!" meaning the size of munitions needed at the front. Well, 54 caliber munition was gathered in hand. Volunteers from an Iowa regiment, braving a murderous fire of musketry, lugged the heavy crates of ammunition down the road and out to the troops on the firing line. As they began distributing the munitions, they came to the grim realization it was the wrong size. It was virtually of no use whatsoever. But be that as it may, that should not detract from the services of Orion Howe that day. The attack itself would be repulsed. Sherman's losses in this area, not quite 1,000 men. With its troops pushed back here to this ridge, the men of the 1st Battalion, 13th U.S. Infantry managed to salvage their flags and retrieve them to safety. That night around the campfires, as they counted the battle scars, they counted 56 bullet holes in the national colors alone. 3 mini balls and a piece of canister were embedded in the flagstaff, attesting to Sergeant Gardner's claim that men never stood a hotter fire. In the assault against Stockade Redan on this day, the men of the 1st Battalion, 13th U.S. Infantry lost 43% of their men. The next day, as they lined up for inspection, Sherman rode the length of his line, and when he came to the men of the 1st Battalion, he turned to one of his subordinates and said, "My God, is that all that's left of the 13th Infantry?" Sadly enough, it was. Well, Sherman would see to it that his own were taken care of. Following the siege of Vicksburg, when all the battle honors were awarded, Sherman saw to it that the men of the 1st Battalion were ordered to inscribe on their battle flags not just the honor Vicksburg, but first at Vicksburg, for being the first Union regiment to reach the Confederate line. So proud were the officers and men of this unit of that singular honor that they adopted that as their unit motto. And to this date, if you ever run into a member of the 13th United States Infantry, which is still an active Army unit currently stationed at Camp Jackson in South Carolina, you will proudly see emblazoned on their shoulder patches the inscription, "First at Vicksburg." Also, as the battle honors were being awarded, Sherman recalled the bravery of this young musician, who, although badly wounded, still had enough wits about him to report the size of munitions needed at the front. He thought that the boy deserved recognition, and so he put him in for a medal. And in time, a medal was awarded, no less than the Medal of Honor. Orion Howe, on May 19th of 1863, was only 14 years of age, and he is the youngest recipient of our nation's most coveted military award for action here at Vicksburg. The attack on the 19th day of May failed. Why? These obstructions down here in these ravines, it completely destroyed the impetus of Sherman's attack long before it ever reached its objective. In preparation for the attack on May the 22nd, Sherman realized that if this attack is going to succeed, that obstruction must be avoided at all costs. The only avenue of approach that was open, however, was the road itself, which is raked by Confederate cannon in the various forts that we have been talking about. As a result, Sherman is also aware of the fact that there is a ditch fronting the stockade redan, the measurements of which are 8 feet deep, 12 feet wide. It is the last obstacle that has to be overcome if this attack is to succeed. But how do you overcome such an obstacle? Well, Sherman decides to have his men construct fascines. Fascines are simply bundles of cane woven together, make planks and scaling ladders. And the idea was for volunteers to carry these materials forward ahead of the infantry column. When they reach the ditch, throw down these bundles of cane, these fascines, that will fill up a portion of the ditch that can then be planked over, scaling ladders thrown against the wall of the fort, and the infantry column in its assault could simply run down the road, over the planks, up the ladders, over the top, capture the fort, and gain access to Vicksburg. Sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? Now, we've been talking for days now about the situation here at Vicksburg in 1863. Today we see a dense forest. This was not here in 1863. You recall, it's a clear, unobstructed view between the opposing lines of battle. Where is Sherman going to get the material to build the planks and scaling ladders? Well, while he is making his reconnaissance of the area, Sherman spots a wooden frame building about a mile to the rear. And so on the night of May the 21st, the night prior to the scheduled assault, he calls for volunteers to go down and dismantle this building. And he sends them under cover of darkness. Now immediately, red flags ought to be going off in your mind. First of all, he calls for volunteers. Second of all, he sends them down under cover of darkness. What's the first thing you learn in the Army? Well, actually, that's the second thing. First thing is don't ask, don't tell. Never volunteer for anything, right? Because you know, regardless of how simple it sounds, something bad's going to happen to you. Well, sure enough, something bad was going to happen to these volunteers, for Sherman left out a strategic piece of information, namely the fact that this building was occupied, not by disloyal citizens, but no less an individual than Major General Ulysses S. Grant, the Army commander, who was using this building as his headquarters. So these men go on their merry way down toward this building. You would think that the guard in front of the building would have tipped them off. But when they got there, they started throwing rocks through the window, pulling boards off the wall, and Grant was inside at this time, sound asleep. You can imagine these volunteers when suddenly they heard a familiar voice from inside the building demanding to know, "What is going on here?" And out walks Grant in his night clothes. Well, these men stutter their way through an explanation. Grant listens patiently, and then without comment, vacates the building and sets up his headquarters in a tent, where he remained for the duration of the siege. Well, that building was leveled in record time. The planks, the scaling ladders, the bundles of cane are all in readiness. 150 men volunteered to carry these materials forward, dubbed the Forlorn Hope. They will precede the infantry column on the morning of May the 22nd. Well, with the rising sun on May the 22nd, more than 200 Union artillery pieces along a broad 3-mile front will open fire against the Confederate fortifications and pummel those works with solid shot and shell for 4 solid hours. The smoke of the guns shrouding the field. But at 10 o'clock in the morning, the prearranged signal for the infantry to assault is given. The guns fall silent, and the volunteers run forward through this thick layer of smoke. As they enter this road cut, you see, midway between us and the stockade redan, all is going well. But the smoke begins to dissipate and rise, exposing the fields for all to see, and the Confederates peering over their parapets catch sight of these men with the planks and scaling ladders. They rise in mass, let loose a withering volley, toppling scores of these men. But those who were unharmed, true to their mission, reach the ditch, throw the bundles of cane down that fill up a portion of the ditch. The planks are installed, the scaling ladders thrown against the wall, and the men jump into the ditch themselves for safety and turn to the rear to watch the infantry in its assault. But as they look down the graveyard road, there's no activity at all. The order has never been relayed to the troops to follow the volunteers. Sherman is absolutely livid. But as the attack is expected, it will be made. And without the benefit of concealing smoke, the men of the 15th Army Corps in a tightly packed column of men race down the graveyard road toward their objective. But as they begin emerging from this road cut, the lead elements take such devastating casualties that the bodies of the dead and wounded begin to pile up and form an effective roadblock at that point. The men in the lead refuse to go any farther. With the head of the column now stalled, the rear can go no farther, and it's quite plain to Sherman that this attack has failed, and it has failed miserably. It is about this time that General Grant rides up from the Jackson Road. You recall he has witnessed McPherson's attack. He now comes up to confer with Sherman, and he asks Uncle Billy how things were going. Without comment, Sherman simply pointed to the front, and Grant got the picture. He was on the verge of calling these men back when that courier races up from the south with a note from John McClernand that says, "I'm in part possession of 2 Confederate forts over which the stars and stripes are gloriously flying," and he asks that the attacks be renewed. Although Grant doubts the veracity of this note, he will order those assaults renewed. Now, in Grant's own memoirs, he'll talk about receiving McClernand's note right behind us here, and that he turned with his looking glass in hand to see what was going on. And he says that he could see that McClernand was not having any success, that this note wasn't true. Well, I have news for you folks. Grant could not see that area from here, because intervening between us and where McClernand's attacking is the Jackson Road, which is about 70 feet higher than where we currently are. He certainly couldn't see over it. He couldn't see through it. But an experienced combat officer, as was General Grant, could tell by the sounds of firing emanating from the south that this note couldn't possibly be true. But if his subordinate on the field of battle says he's in possession of 2 forts, he has no recourse but to renew these assaults. Thus, on May the 22nd of 1863, Sherman's men once again will surge down the graveyard road toward the stockade redan, only to be repulsed. They will launch yet another wave, filing their way down into these ravines once again, filtering their way through the obstruction of felled trees and clawing their way up the opposite slopes. Although they succeed in planting their colors atop the parapets in several different areas, they are driven back at the point of bayonet. Union losses this day in excess of 3,000 soldiers. And so his nose bloody twice, Grant will lay siege to the city. Now here along the graveyard road, just as along the Jackson Road where we were just a few moments ago, the Federal soldiers would excavate a number of various approaches with the object of mining the stockade redan and its supporting fortifications. If you follow all these blue tablets around, you'll see how they're zigzagging back and forth. We won't take the time today to follow along what became known as Ewing's approach. Suffice it to say, if you look at the stockade redan, on the north wall, which is your right, you'll see an upright blue tablet. That's where the gallery began. Union soldiers were in the process of excavating a gallery directly underneath the stockade redan when, on July the 3rd, white flags of truce appeared along the line and all firing stopped. And so no mine is ever planted at this location. But had Pemberton not surrendered his garrison on July the 4th, 2 days later, that fort before you would have been destroyed in a massive explosion. Any questions at this point?
What was all this land used for during the Civil War?
The question was, what was all this land used for during the Civil War? At the outbreak of the Civil War, you recall that Vicksburg is the second largest city in the state of Mississippi, boasting a population of 5,000 souls. Out here in this area, we're about 2 miles from the old courthouse in the heart of the Vicksburg community. Out this far, it was a scattering of fields plus a lot of virgin timber. In fact, as Sam Lockett, the Confederate Army's chief engineer, is reconnoitering through the hills and hollows of Vicksburg to design his fortifications, he recorded that no greater topographical puzzle ever presented itself to an engineer. And he talked about this maze of ridges, narrow ridges fronted by deep, steep ravines, and he mentioned how many of those had never been cleared of their virgin forest. And so that virgin forest would be cleared to construct fortifications, clear fields of fire, and form these obstructions of felled trees. Thus, in the aftermath of siege and Civil War, with this area cleared by the soldiers, farmers immediately moved into this area to cultivate the now cleared area and use it for grazing of cattle, sheep, horses, and so on. And it remained in that usage all the way up until the establishment of the national park. Folks, yes, sir?
They're digging these trenches to get to the objective. You said they were 8 feet wide, 7 feet deep?
Correct.
Okay. Is that 7 feet, and they're throwing dirt out of 7 feet? Or
Correct.
Okay.
They're tossing out additional dirt. In fact, with the dirt being tossed out to the side, a man mounted on horseback could actually ride up and down these approaches with impunity. Folks, what we're going to do now is reboard the bus. We're going to exit the park and have our lunch. We'll then come back to this very location and resume our tour this afternoon, okay? Ma'am. Here on your right is a relief portrait of William LeBaron Jenney. Jenney was the chief engineer of the 15th Army Corps and would oversee the various approach operations in this area. Jenney went on to become an architect of note, constructing the very first skyscraper in America, the Jenney Building in Chicago, a whopping 10 stories tall. He would also go on to design the Illinois Monument here at Vicksburg. Here you see the ravines that would have been choked with the abattis of fallen trees. They are very deep, very steep, and even under the best of circumstances, you'll be on all fours climbing out of them. You can see many of the erosions and slough-offs we suffered just a few weeks ago. This lowest soil, it's like talcum powder. It absolutely dissolves in rain. This is Ed Washington, the grandnephew of George Washington, commander of the 1st Battalion, who led his forces against this stockade on May the 19th and succeeded in planting their colors. Now, Washington himself would be badly wounded down in those ravines, clambering over a post and rail fence, which was one of the many obstructions to the Federal advance. Badly wounded as he lay on the ground, the flag bearer, the man who was carrying the flag at the time, went over to Washington to catch his dying words. He was unbuckling his sword belt and asked that his sword, his pistol, and his watch be given to the next in command, and that of course would be Charles Ewing. But Ewing would also be badly wounded during the course of this battle. But that evening, the Confederates came out into the no man's land area, retrieved many of the Union soldiers, including Captain Washington. So he died as a prisoner of war somewhere behind the stockade redan. His final resting place is unknown. This is the Arkansas Monument on our right. We'll talk more about this afternoon when we come on back. As we go to our luncheon destination, anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? Very well, allow me to take advantage of this opportunity then, since we have some time, and touch on Joseph E. Johnston and the so-called Army of Relief. Now, you recall Joe Johnston had been sent by President Jefferson Davis to attempt to salvage the rapidly deteriorating situation in Mississippi. He arrives in the capital city of Jackson on the night of May the 13th, just a few hours before Sherman and McPherson assault the city. He arrives in Jackson after a very long and torturous train ride. He is not well physically, he certainly is not well mentally. He doesn't want to come to Mississippi. His very first message to the War Department is, "I am too late." And again, I think that gives you an indication of his actions for the remainder of this campaign. What leads him to believe this? Well, Johnston had come to Mississippi In December of 1862, on December the 21st, just prior to Christmas, on an inspection tour with Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Now you recall these two men are very similar. They are both graduates of West Point. They are both veterans of the Mexican War. Now Davis and Johnston will examine Pemberton's garrison as well as the fortifications of Vicksburg. Davis is impressed by these fortifications, declares them strong, formidable, says they can never be taken. Johnston looks at that exact same line of defense and declares it to be nothing but an elaborate trap, and warned that any army that ever fell back into these defenses and allowed itself to be besieged, you can write it off. It is as good as gone. Thus, when Pemberton falls back into the city's fortifications on May the 17th and notifies Johnston of that effect, Johnston, in my estimation, writes him off. Joe Johnston, you recall, is of the mindset that the Confederacy needed to utilize its limited manpower to concentrate it into large mobile armies in which to do battle with the enemy. He was not one of these like Davis, who wanted to hold on to every square inch of the Confederacy. So there are some significant philosophical differences between Davis and Johnston. Despite these philosophical differences, Joe Johnston is sent to Mississippi. For the remainder of the month of May, Johnston would gather his army of relief. By June the 3rd, his army will number 30,000 soldiers. He will not get another man. Although he tells Davis, I need more men, I need more wagons, I need more ammunition, I need this, I need that. Davis says you have every available man and gun that can be spared from elsewhere in the Confederacy. Move! Although he gets such a strong directive, Johnston does not move. Rather, he then goes back to his age-old controversy with Jefferson Davis. Well, exactly what is my command authority? I should have been top general in the Confederacy. You know it as well as I do. That type of attitude. But finally, on late in June, he will get a note from Pemberton saying that he could hold out for, I think, 15 days longer, at which time his food supplies would be completely gone. And he asked Joe Johnston if he would open up communications with Grant to discuss the surrender of the city. Johnston replied back saying, if it has come to that, you have my permission to do so. But I should not make the overture because it would be an admission of my own weakness, which I ought not to inform General Grant of. Knowing that Pemberton is reaching the final stages of this siege, my personal opinion here, folks, Joe Johnston is a vainglorious, egotistical man. He cherishes his reputation. He realizes that if Vicksburg surrenders and he does not move to its relief, he will be castigated by the people of the South. And so, for that reason, and only that reason, on July the 1st, he finally makes a move. But by July 1st, it's too little, it's too late. He does reach the line of the Big Black River on July the 3rd. And as his advanced forces are moving toward the Big Black, he suddenly realizes that the firing in Vicksburg had stopped. Based on his communication with Pemberton, he knows exactly what that means. The siege has ended. And so he turns his army around, beats a precipitate retreat back into Jackson, and his operations in the Vicksburg Campaign, for all intents and purposes, come to an inglorious end. That's my personal take on Joe Johnston. Now, my personal take may not coincide with other historians, certainly not the popular ones, but that's my take on it. Yes, sir.
Do you think Shelby Foote did a good job on his narrative of the Vicksburg? Do you like what he wrote, in other words?
Shelby Foote is a delightful writer. And I'll leave it at that. How's that? Here on your right, ladies and gentlemen, is the statue to Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis, the favorite son, if you will, of Vicksburg and Warren County, is Plantation Briarfield, about 18 miles south of here. And so we do have a beautiful standing statue of the Confederate president. It was the work of sculptor Henry Kitson. And we also have a brand new statue of Jefferson Davis that we'll see this afternoon, incorporated into the Kentucky State Monument. So we have two statues of Jefferson Davis. I think of the two, the one by Henry Kitson is far superior. Here we are back at the Park Visitor Center. We're going to be exiting the park at this point. George, at the stop sign in front of the park, the traffic light in front of the park will turn left, go down the hill, get back on Interstate 20 and head west. Yes, sir.
Do you think Pemberton was the best available choice to be put in charge?
Well, do I think Pemberton was the best available choice to be put in charge in this area? Let's take a look at the time period in which he was appointed to command of the Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana, which is in the fall of 1862. The situation here on the Vicksburg front is relatively quiet. Pemberton has gotten into trouble in Charleston, where he commands the Department of South Carolina and Georgia, because as departmental commander, he actually is recommending that Charleston be abandoned, evacuated, as being untenable. Could you imagine that if you were Confederate President Jefferson Davis? Can you imagine that if you were the governor of the state of South Carolina? Can you imagine that if you were one of the blue bloods of Charleston? My God, this guy's talking about evacuating our city. That was intolerable, just the mere thought of it. And for that reason, Pemberton gets in a heck of a lot of hot water with the administration in Richmond. And so much so that Jefferson Davis will instruct his military advisor, Robert E. Lee, to consult with John Pemberton. And Lee admonishes Pemberton that he will hold Charleston to the last man, that he will fight street by street, house by house if need be, but Charleston will be held. Well, shortly after that, he is relieved of his command and sent out west. Davis has no alternative. He has to remove Pemberton from the command in Charleston. As he looks around for another place to put him, he sees the Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana. Yes, it's a significant department. Yes, it has a lot of forces, but it's a relatively quiet area at that point in time. And I think for that reason, primarily, he will send Pemberton to the west. The people of Charleston, of course, want P.G.T. Beauregard in command of their city. And so Davis will do the switch. He'll send Pemberton out west, where hopefully things will remain quiet. But unfortunately for the Confederate president, as well as for General Pemberton himself, things immediately start heating up once Pemberton arrives. But in the early stages, these are the various bayou operations, the battle at Chickasaw Bayou. Pemberton is successful in parrying all these blows, which really boost his confidence, which really make the people of Mississippi think, hey, maybe this guy's pretty good after all. But I suggest to you that just about any commander could have parried those blows. When it finally comes down to showing his true ability, Pemberton is found sadly lacking. Sadly lacking.
Do you think Beauregard would have been a better choice?
Beauregard is a far more experienced officer. He's a far more confident officer as well. Pemberton is indecisive. Pemberton has very low self-esteem. He lacks confidence. He's a northerner by birth. As a result, he's distrusted by many men of the ranks, and he is well aware of that. As a result, Pemberton is reluctant to do anything that does not meet with the approval of his subordinate officers, which almost to a man are Southerners. So he does call frequent councils of war, and more often than not, he will adhere to their decision, even if it goes contrary to his own opinion. So he does not exercise strong leadership at all.
George, we'll take exit 1A once again, and off the exit ramp, we'll turn right.
You're doing good, George.
Yeah, George did a real good job turning the bus around on Graveyard Road. It's an extremely tight turn.
Didn't see my left eye. This is a truck. What do you think, he had a horn?
all of the interior. Trust it from the inside out. It also gives wasps a wonderful place to nest against snakes and stuff like that. But anyway, we're very concerned that these carriages are weakening to the point that a school bus pulls up and 60 kids jump on one cannon. It's an awful lot of weight, and they have been starting to collapse at other national parks, including Vicksburg. So we're trying to stay ahead of the curve and replacing before it really become a problem. Here in Vicksburg, we pride ourselves on being proactive in our management of the park. Don't wait until catastrophes happen to start replacing when we start doing kind of failure.
Folks, this is how we are oriented. The Mississippi River, you can see it through the trees just off to your right. The Warrenton Road on your left. We are at South Fort, the southern anchor of the Confederate defense perimeter around the fortress city of Vicksburg. This is one of those 9 major forts connecting the various road access points to Vicksburg. And of course, South Fort will guard the Warrenton Road, which is the main access point from the south that connects Vicksburg with Grand Gulf, Port Gibson, and Natchez, the state's largest city. The guns in this fort are also guarding the river approaches to Vicksburg. These guns, for example, such as this big Columbiad off to your right, would give warning to Farragut Squadron as he came upriver. You're getting too close, we're here, we're going to stop you. That's the whole purpose of this fort. Now, this fort that you are in is virtually in its original state. Most of the other forts that you'll see in the park today have been reconstructed / restored. First of all by the War Department when it assumed control of this park in the early part of the 1900s, and then again by the National Park Service in the 1960s. The administrative record indicates that there has never been any restoration work on this fort whatsoever. So this is still very much the way it was when the soldiers left it in 1863. I brought you over here today, first of all, to show you this fort. This is one area that is part of the park that hardly ever gets any visitors other than drunks coming in off of Washington Street, occasional drug uses, things of that nature. So this is nice to have a bona fide use of park facilities here today.
Illicit sex.
But also here in South Fort was positioned the troops of the Virginia Battery, the Botetourt Artillery. You'll recall we talked about Sergeant Francis Obenchain and the Botetourt Artillery at Port Gibson. We talked about Sergeant Obenchain and the guns of the Botetourt at Champion Hill yesterday. They lost 4 cannon at Port Gibson. Their 2 remaining guns at Champion Hill on May the 16th. Thus, as the Virginia Battery falls back into Vicksburg after the Battle of Big Black River Bridge, they are given 2 cannon from the Artillery Reserve. Those 2 guns, both of which are 6-pounders, will be in a lunette, a crescent-shaped fortification about a quarter mile off to your left rear, near where the Vicksburg Little Theater stands today. Having far more men than was necessary to man 2 small field pieces, the rest of the Virginia artillerists were given Enfield rifle muskets and placed in the defense perimeter. Those Virginians manned this fort and a rifle pit off to the north here that connected South Fort with the next battery in line known as Battery Barnes. And these Virginians would be guarding the Warrenton Road access and guarding against any attempt by the Federals to possibly land at the base of this bluff and ascend the high ground. Now, Sergeant Francis Obenchain was placed in command of the troops that were in the infantry line. His headquarters tent was pitched right in the middle of the Warrenton Road, just behind us here, where it was in defilade, or at least not visible, to the Union artillerymen down the road here at Navy Circle. One day during the siege, Captain John Johnston, the battery's commander, who had been elevated after the Battle of Champion Hill to Division Chief of Artillery, was making an inspection tour of the artillery positions along Carter Stevenson's front, and he sees Sergeant Francis Obenchain sitting on a limber wagon reading a book with bullets whizzing past his head. And he says, "By God, John, get your head down, you'll be killed." And Obenchain, without even looking up from the pages of his book, says, "You may not realize this, but you're as in much danger where you are as I am here. There's no place of safety anywhere, so what's it matter where I get killed?" So he continued reading his book. Now, the Virginians also had a water barrel set up in the road. to provide for their troops. So at least they had a little more fresh water coming from Stouts Bayou than did most of the other troops in the defense perimeter around Vicksburg. But on July the 4th of 1863, white flags, of course, appear along the lines. Coming out from the Union lines were several officers in blue who demanded of Sergeant Obenchain that he surrender this fort. He says, "I have no orders to do so, and by God, I will defend this fort to the last extremity." And he told the Union officers either to return to their lines immediately or he'd take them prisoner. Well, shortly thereafter, word reaches the lines that the city has surrendered, at which time the Union officers return and demand surrender of the fort. And they also demand surrender of Obenchain's flag. The flag of the Botetourt artillery was here at this fort, snapping in the breeze. Obenchain simply pointed to it and says, "There it stands, go get it yourself." And these Union officers threatened him, saying that if he didn't surrender the flag formally to them, that he would be shipped off to Alton Prison in Illinois. And so Obenchain in his letters wrote that he walked up the wall of the fort, retrieved the flag, and I surrendered it the best way I know how. And so the fort would fall into federal hands. Union troops would march in along the Warrenton Road, just as they did along the Jackson Road, and occupy the city. Now, to minimize any friction between the civilian population and the Union Army, not all of Grant's army marches into Vicksburg on July 4th. Rather, only 3 separate units. I think 1 division from the south, 1 division from the east, and 1 division from the north were authorized to march into the city of Vicksburg.